The Lewis family had planned the road trip for years. James, a software engineer, his wife, Clara, a history professor, their teenage son, Dylan, and 7-year-old Lily, the curious one. They were heading to a national park deep in the Midwest when a detour changed everything. It started with a sudden downpour, the kind of rain that painted the windshield opaque in seconds. James slowed the car to a crawl, squinting through the watery blur. The GPS began glitching, the screen flickering between a map and a static-laden black screen. "Just keep going straight," Clara said, frowning at the strange, archaic look of the map. The voice on the GPS, oddly monotone, repeated, "Continue forward." Minutes later, the rain ceased as suddenly as it had begun. They found themselves on a narrow, cracked road with dense woods hemming them in. The air was thick still and wrong. "Dad, are we lost?" Dylan asked from the back seat, his voice betraying more fear than he wanted to admit. "No, it's a shortcut," James replied, trying to sound confident. Ahead, a sign emerged from the mist. "Welcome to Sycamore Grove." It was an old wooden sign, faded and cracked, as though no one had tended to it in decades. Beyond it stretched a small town, strangely idyllic. The houses were quaint, with manicured lawns and white picket fences. Children played in the yards. An elderly couple waved warmly from their porch. "It's cute," Clara said uneasily. Lily clapped her hands from her booster seat, thrilled at the sight of a carousel in the town square. James pulled into the first gas station, only to find it abandoned. The pumps were covered in vines, and the air smelled faintly of rust. Clara stepped out and glanced at the horizon. The forest surrounding the town was unusually dark, and she could swear she saw shadows shifting between the trees. "Maybe we should ask for directions," James said, nodding toward a diner across the street. Its neon sign flickered. "Open." Inside, the diner was stuck in time, a 1950s-style setup with checkered floors and red booths. A man behind the counter greeted them with an eerie politeness. His name tag read Earl, but he looked impossibly tired, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in years. "You're new here," Earl said, placing 4 mismatched glasses of water on their table. "Where are you headed?" "Back to the interstate," James said. "We just need to find our way out." At this, Earl's face darkened. He leaned in and whispered, "There's no leaving." Clara laughed nervously. "Excuse me?" Earl didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward the window. The sky had begun to darken unnaturally fast, as though night was being forced upon the town. He pointed to the clock on the wall. It read 6:58. "Whatever you do," he said, his voice dropping, "be inside by 7 o'clock." Before James could ask more, the bell above the diner door jingled. A group of townsfolk entered, their faces blank and emotionless. They moved in perfect sync like puppets on strings. "Get back to your car," Earl hissed, his voice trembling. The Lewis family hurried out, but not before Dylan turned back. One of the townsfolk, a girl about his age, locked eyes with him. Her smile was wide, too wide, and her teeth were sharp, almost animalistic. She mouthed 2 words, "Stay forever." Back in the car, James slammed on the gas, speeding toward the town's exit. Yet no matter which road he took, they always looped back to the same roundabout in the center of town, where the carousel turned, creaking, though no one was riding it. "What's happening?" Clara cried, gripping her seat as James tried again and again to escape. The sky was now completely black, and the air grew colder with each failed attempt. Then the car's headlights caught something, a figure standing in the road. It was a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair covering her face. She raised a single hand, pointing toward the woods. As James swerved to avoid her, the car spun out of control and crashed into a ditch. Dazed, the family scrambled out of the vehicle. The sound of rustling leaves surrounded them. louder and closer with every second. From the forest's edge, shadows began to emerge. Figures, dozens of them. Some crawled on all fours, their movements unnatural and jerky. Others walked upright, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. James grabbed Lily, and the family ran toward the nearest house, its porch light flickering like a dying beacon. The door opened before they could knock, and Earl stood there, shotgun in hand. "Welcome to Sycamore Grove," he said grimly, pulling them inside and slamming the door shut. From outside, a voice whispered through the cracks of the wooden walls, low and guttural. "You can run, but you'll never leave." Inside Earl's house, the Lewis family huddled together, trembling as the whispers outside grew louder. Earl moved quickly, bolting windows and securing doors with heavy iron latches. The room smelled faintly of sage, and odd trinkets hung from the ceiling: dried herbs, feathers, and small wooden carvings. "What is going on here?" James demanded, his voice shaky. "What were those things out there?" "Demons," Earl said flatly. "Or whatever you want to call them. They come out after dark, and they don't stop hunting until sunrise." Clara glanced at one of the wooden carvings on the wall. It was crude but unsettling. A human figure with hollow eyes and jagged lines carved into its chest. "What are these?" she asked. Earl handed Clara one of the carvings. It felt strangely warm, as if it pulsed faintly with life. "That's a talisman," he said. "It's the only thing keeping those demons out. Every house here has them. Lose it, and you might as well invite them in." Dylan reached out to touch one, but Earl snapped, "Don't. These things are temperamental. You mess with one, it stops working." The room fell silent except for the faint scratching at the windows. Earl glanced at the clock. "It's 7:30. They're just testing now. Come midnight, they'll get serious." Lily, still clutching her stuffed rabbit, whispered, "Why do they look like people?" "They want you to let them in," Earl said. "They'll knock, they'll beg. They'll even cry like children. But it's a trick. You open that door, and you're dead." James rubbed his temples, his mind racing. "Why are we stuck here? How do we leave?" Earl's expression darkened. "You don't. The town doesn't let anyone go. The roads, the forest, everything loops back here. We've all tried. The only way out is in a pine box." Clara bristled. "There has to be a way. There's always a way." Earl shrugged. "Believe me, I've heard that before. Everyone here has a story about how they got trapped. Some were just passing through like you. Others, well, they belong here. The town chooses who stays." "Belong here?" Dylan asked. "What does that even mean?" Earl didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a shotgun from the corner and began loading shells. "You'll learn the rules fast enough. Rule 1. Never go outside after dark. Rule 2. Keep the talismans close. Rule 3. Trust no one you didn't walk in with." A loud knock echoed from the front door, making everyone jump. Earl froze, his eyes narrowing. "Don't make a sound." The knocking came again, followed by a soft voice. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here." Clara clutched Lily tighter as the voice continued. "I'm lost. I just need to use your phone. Please. I'm begging you." Lily whimpered. "It sounds like a lady." Earl's grip on the shotgun tightened. "It's not a lady. That thing has been lost for as long as I've been here." The knocking grew louder, more desperate. The voice changed, becoming guttural and deep. "Let me in," it bellowed, shaking the walls. Dylan glanced at the window, his curiosity getting the better of him. Peeking through the curtains, he saw a woman with long, black hair standing on the porch. Her face was obscured, but her hands pressed against the glass, leaving smudges that oozed a black, tar-like substance. "Get away from the window," Earl hissed, yanking Dylan back. He muttered something under his breath, a chant or prayer, and the talisman on the wall began to glow faintly. The smudges on the window sizzled and disappeared. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low growl that slowly faded into the night. Earl exhaled deeply. That was a weak one. If we're lucky, the stronger ones won't notice you're here. James, still trying to process everything, asked, "Why don't they just break in? Why do the talismans work?" Earl's face was grim. "They don't like order. These carvings, ancient symbols, chants, they confuse them, keep them out. But they're not foolproof. They've failed before." He paused, looking toward the back door. "When that happens, it's a massacre." Lily tugged at Clara's sleeve. "What about the other people in the town? Are they safe?" Earl chuckled darkly. "Safe? Maybe for now, but some of them aren't who they seem. Rule 4. If someone starts acting strange, keep your distance." "What do you mean, acting strange?" James asked. Earl leaned closer, his voice low. "The demons can't come in without an invitation, but sometimes they find another way. They can whisper to people, turn them against you. If someone starts hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, well, you'll know." A sudden crash from upstairs made everyone jump. Earl cursed under his breath and motioned for them to stay put. He climbed the stairs, shotgun at the ready. "What was that?" Clara whispered. "Probably nothing," James said, though his voice betrayed his fear. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Then Earl's voice rang out. "It's clear." Relieved, James started to relax, but Dylan whispered, "It wasn't clear." "What?" Clara asked. Dylan pointed toward the staircase. At the top stood a figure, a little girl in a white dress. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth twisted into an unnaturally wide grin. "Earl!" James shouted. The figure vanished in an instant, leaving only the faint sound of laughter echoing through the house. Earl stormed back down, his face pale. "They're toying with us now," he muttered. "We got to make it to sunrise. After that, we'll figure out what to do with you." James looked at him, fear and desperation in his eyes. "What do you mean, figure it out? We're getting out of this place." Earl shook his head. "There's no out. There's just surviving until tomorrow." The night pressed on, and the whispers outside the house grew louder, almost taunting. Earl paced the living room, his shotgun never leaving his hands, while the Lewis family huddled on the worn-out sofa. The glow of the talismans cast eerie shadows across the room, their faint warmth offering the only semblance of safety. "We can't just sit here," James said, his voice shaking with frustration. "We have to find a way out. There has to be something we're missing." Earl shot him a grim look. "You think I haven't tried? I've been stuck in this hellhole for 15 years. You learn real quick that the only thing you can do is survive." 15 years? Clara asked, horrified. How? How do you live like this?" Earl didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. "We'll talk later. If we make it." A sudden, sharp knock at the back door cut through the tense silence. Everyone froze. Earl raised his hand, motioning for them to stay still. The knock came again, this time accompanied by a voice. "Dad? Mom?" It was Dylan's voice, but Dylan was sitting right there, clutching Clara's arm. The boy's face went pale. That's me." Clara pulled Dylan closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do they want from us?" "They want you to believe," Earl said, his voice low. "They'll say or do anything to make you open that door." The knocking turned into pounding, each blow rattling the door in its frame. "Mom, please. It's me. Let me in." The voice was frantic now, pleading, and it sounded exactly like Dylan. James moved to stand, but Earl blocked him. "Don't you dare," Earl growled. "That thing out there isn't your son." Lily whimpered, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. "Make it stop." As if in response, the pounding ceased. The silence was worse, thick and oppressive, as though the very air had turned against them. Then, the voice returned, calm and cold. "You'll let me in eventually." "They always do." James sank back onto the sofa, his face ashen. "What are we supposed to do? Just wait for them to kill us?" Earl shook his head. "They can't get in unless we give them an opening. But they're patient. They'll wear you down, make you doubt everything. That's why the rules exist." "What happens if someone breaks the rules?" Clara asked quietly. Earl hesitated, then sighed. "You don't want to know." Before she could press him further, there was a crash upstairs, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Earl bolted toward the staircase, motioning for the family to stay put. "What if it's another one of them?" Clara whispered. James clenched his fists. "We can't just sit here. If Earl needs help, stay." Earl barked from the stairs, his voice firm. "Whatever you do, don't leave this room." He disappeared into the darkness, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the creaking of floorboards and the faint scratching at the windows. Then, a scream shattered the silence. It was Earl's voice. James jumped to his feet, ignoring Clara's protests. "I'm not waiting around for this." He grabbed a fire poker from the fireplace and started up the stairs, Dylan close behind him. "Stay with your mom," James hissed, but Dylan shook his head. "I'm not letting you go alone." The two climbed the stairs cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of a talisman nailed above a door at the far end. Earl's shotgun lay abandoned on the floor, but there was no sign of him. "Earl," James called out, his voice barely above a whisper. A faint noise came from one of the rooms, a wet, slithering sound that sent chills down their spines. James pushed the door open, his hands trembling. Inside, Earl was on the floor, his back against the wall. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. Across from him stood a man, a perfect replica of Earl, down to the worn flannel shirt and the scars on his hands. The second Earl smiled, his teeth too sharp, his eyes too black. "Get out," the real Earl croaked. "That's not me." The imposter tilted its head, studying James and Dylan. "He's lying," it said in Earl's voice. "I'm the real one. He's the one you should fear." Dylan took a step back, his grip tightening on his father's arm. "Dad, what do we do?" James hesitated, the fire poker shaking in his hand. "Which one of you is real?" The imposter laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "Does it matter? In the end, you'll trust the wrong one." The talisman above the door began to flicker, its glow weakening. The real Earl groaned, trying to reach for something in his pocket, but the imposter moved first. In an instant, it lunged at James, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. James swung the fire poker, striking the creature across the face. It staggered back, hissing as the talisman flared brightly. The creature shrieked, its form distorting, before it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. Earl collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. "They're testing you," he said weakly. "Next time, they won't be so easy to beat." James helped him to his feet, his mind reeling. "We need to get out of here. There has to be a way." "There is no way," Earl said, his voice bitter. "The only thing you can do is survive the night." Back downstairs, Clara and Lily were waiting, their faces etched with fear. As James and Dylan helped Earl to a chair, the clock on the wall struck midnight, and the real horrors began. The clock struck midnight, and the house seemed to shift, the walls groaning as though alive. The talismans flared briefly, their glow dimming again, as if the energy within them was struggling to hold against something more powerful. Earl tightened his grip on his shotgun, his face pale and drawn. "They've started. Whatever happens, stay close to the talismans. If one goes dark, we're done for." Outside, The scratching and whispers had escalated to a cacophony of guttural growls and distorted voices. It was as if the night itself had come alive, crawling with unseen terrors. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. "They're testing the house," Earl whispered. "But this is different." James peered through the crack in the curtains, his breath hitching at the sight. A man stood in the yard, wearing a sheriff's uniform. His face was shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence radiated menace. He held a lantern, its light casting flickering shadows that seemed to writhe unnaturally. "That's not one of them, is it?" James asked, his voice barely audible. Earl's eyes narrowed. "He's new. I've never seen that one before." His voice dropped to a murmur. "It's getting smarter." The sheriff tilted his head toward the house, as though sensing James's gaze. Slowly, he raised his lantern, and the light grew brighter, spilling into the room like liquid gold. For a moment, the talismans flickered dangerously, their glow nearly extinguished. Earl reacted instantly, grabbing a pouch from a drawer and scattering a fine powder around the talismans. The carvings blazed brighter, forcing the golden light back. Outside, the sheriff snarled, a guttural sound that didn't belong in any human throat. "Is this going to hold?" Clara asked, clutching Lily to her chest. "For now," Earl said, though his expression betrayed doubt. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the back of the house. Then another. The sound of wood splintering filled the air. "They're trying the kitchen door," Earl said, moving toward the sound. "James with me." James grabbed the fire poker again, his hands trembling. "What am I supposed to do with this?" "Swing hard and don't stop," Earl said grimly. In the kitchen, the door shuddered under the weight of something enormous. Black tendrils, slick and wet, snaked through the cracks, probing the air like living things. Earl fired the shotgun, the blast tearing through the door and causing the tendrils to writhe and retreat. But almost immediately, they returned, this time stronger. "We can't hold them off forever," James yelled. Earl ignored him, pulling out another talisman for his pocket. This one was different, larger and carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly blue. He pressed it to the door, and the tendrils shrieked, recoiling as if burned. "It won't last," Earl said. "We need to figure out why they're focusing on this house." "They're after us," Clara said from the doorway, her voice trembling. "We're the new ones. They always test the newcomers, don't they?" Earl didn't deny it. "They're drawn to the fresh blood. But this feels bigger." The talisman in the kitchen dimmed slightly, and the whispers outside grew louder. Earl frowned. "That sheriff, he's leading them. He's stronger than the others." "What do we do?" Clara asked. Earl hesitated, then motioned toward a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. "There's a basement. It's not safe, but it's safer than up here. Go. Now!" As James helped Clara and the children down the narrow stairs, Dylan paused. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Earl said. "I've got one last trick to slow them down." The basement was cold and damp, lit by a single flickering bulb. Strange symbols were painted on the walls, and more talismans hung from the ceiling. Clara hugged Lily tightly as James scanned the room, looking for anything that might help them. "What's that?" Dylan asked, pointing to a large map pinned to the far wall. It depicted the town, but the roads and buildings were overlaid with strange patterns and symbols. "It's like a puzzle," James said, stepping closer. "Look, these marks show where the talismans are. And these lines, they're roads, but they don't connect." "They connect," Dylan said, tracing a finger over the map. "Look here, it loops back, just like the roads we drove on." James's heart raced. If this is right, there's a center to the loop. Maybe that's where we need to go. Before they could study it further, a loud crash echoed from above, followed by Earl's voice shouting, "Go, you bastards!" "Earl!" Clara cried. James grabbed the map and stuffed it into his jacket. "Stay here. I'll get him." "No," Clara protested, but James was already climbing the stairs. The kitchen was in shambles. The door was gone, and black tendrils were creeping inside. Earl stood his ground, firing shell after shell, but the creatures kept coming. The sheriff loomed in the doorway, his lantern now burning with an unnatural black flame. "Get back!" Earl shouted, tossing a small talisman toward the sheriff. It flared brightly, forcing the figure to step back, but it wasn't enough. James grabbed Earl by the arm. "We have to go." Earl nodded reluctantly, but as they turned toward the basement, one of the tendrils lashed out, striking Earl in the side. He cried out, collapsing to the floor. "Go!" Earl groaned. "Take the family and run." James hesitated, but the sheriff stepped forward, his voice deep and distorted. "You can't run forever. You belong to us now." James pulled Earl to his feet, half dragging him toward the trapdoor. "We'll see about that." As they disappeared into the basement, the sheriff stepped inside the house, his lantern casting shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. He smiled, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. "You can't hide," he whispered. "The hunt has only just begun." The basement grew colder with every passing minute, the whispers and scratching outside intensifying into a crescendo of unearthly sounds. Earl sat in the corner, his breathing shallow, while Clara clung to Lily, trying to keep her daughter calm. Dylan and James took turns watching the trapdoor, bracing for any sign of the horrors above breaking through. "How much longer?" James asked, his voice taut with exhaustion. Earl glanced at his watch. "A few more hours, if the talismans hold." The glow of the talismans overhead flickered occasionally, dimming for seconds that felt like hours before flaring back to life. Each time the light wavered, the sounds outside grew louder, more aggressive. "Why does it feel like they're winning?" Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're not," Earl said. "They get louder the closer it gets to sunrise." Desperation, but they know the rules. They can't take us while the talismans burn. James sat down beside Clara, wrapping an arm around her and Lily. "We're going to make it," he said, though his words sounded hollow even to him. The hours crawled by, the family huddled together in the dim, oppressive basement. Once or twice, the trapdoor rattled as if something was testing it, but it never opened. Earl gripped his shotgun tightly, ready for the worst. Finally, as the tension reached its peak, the sounds outside began to change. The guttural growls softened, replaced by a strange, high-pitched keening that seemed to echo through the air. Earl's face tightened. "They're retreating," he muttered. "Is it over?" Clara asked, hope flickering in her voice. Earl shook his head. "Not over. Just paused. Sunrise is the only thing that drives them back. They'll return tonight, and the night after that." As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the basement door, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the talismans stopped glowing. Earl rose slowly, wincing as he held his injured side. "Come on," he said. "Let's see what's left of the house." The family climbed the stairs, their legs stiff and bodies aching from the night's ordeal. The house was battered but intact, the talismans still hanging on the walls, though their glow had entirely faded. Outside, the streets were quiet, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Lily looked out the window and pointed. "It's gone." The sheriff's lantern, once burning with unnatural black flames, lay shattered in the street. The strange man himself was nowhere to be seen. James exhaled slowly. "We made it." Earl gave a bitter chuckle. "You made it through one night. Welcome to Sycamore Grove. You've got a lifetime of nights ahead of you." "Lifetime?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. "There has to be a way out." "There isn't," Earl said flatly. "No one leaves. Not alive." Dylan looked at his father, his face pale. "So, what do we do?" Earl leaned against the wall, his gaze hard. "You learn the rules. You keep your talismans close. And you survive." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The Lewis family stood in silence, staring out at the deceptively peaceful town. Somewhere in the distance, the carousel creaked as it turned slowly in the morning breeze. And as the sun climbed higher, the shadows of the forest seemed to retreat, but never far enough. They lingered, waiting for the next sunset,